across any sort of obstacles? Because obviously it's kind of seemed as this male-dominated art form, you know, the man on the podium. There's not, let's be frank, many female conductors. And I myself have come across a few comments, you know, well, you know, you are a woman, blah, 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 at various masterclasses. And I was wondering what your experience...
They're brilliant, aren't they, those comments?
Sort of thing was, and how you approached it, and any advice you'd give to someone who might be...
Well, I think it's a better time now than when I was starting out. So I think it's a little bit easier. But, you know, I think clearly there are still issues, because when I started, I assumed probably within 10 years there would be a lot of women on the podiums. And then I looked around 20 years later, 30 years later, there's really the same number, about the same number. Maybe the faces have changed a little bit, but only a handful of women. And I'm still the first woman to do almost everything, you know. I was recently the first woman to conduct at La Scala in the history of the 230-year, you know, and it was like a moon landing had occurred or something. You know, we had a huge they had a huge press conference and everything, and the first question a journalist asked me was, "Do you cook?" I mean, it was really...
That's why you had to take up conducting, wasn't
That's
it?
right,
Your
yeah.
cookery was so dreadful.
Ridiculous. But, so I'm still shocked at the level of ignorance in our world. But at the same time, I think it's really important not to take it on board at all. If you don't get into something, or you don't get something... I never interpreted the many, many rejections I had as being related to my gender. I assumed they were because I wasn't good enough. And so every time I was, and in music you have to be very strong, because you're going to have a lot of rejections. In life, I mean, if you really want to be successful, you have to have a lot of failures. I believe that. I believe to succeed you have to fail massively. And I've been there and done that and continue to do that. But, so you have to be, you have to have, I think, number one, and this is good life advice, I think you have to have a good sense of humor about yourself. You know, when you're on the podium, what happens is that any kind of strange idiosyncrasy that you have, it gets very exaggerated, you know, because 100 people are staring at you. So whatever you do that's weird, and we all do weird things, becomes like super magnified. And I think if you have a good sense of humor about yourself, you know, it puts people at ease. And, you know, I say it like it is. I'm not extraordinarily poetic in my language. I think in my emotions I am. But, you know, often I'll say something to the orchestra and then I'll say, well, that was poetic. You know, I mean, I use sarcasm a lot, and I think it helps. Humor does help, definitely, especially about yourself.
Yes, yeah.
Don't you think, Dave?
Absolutely, yeah.
Sort of, what's your relationship with an ensemble? How do you get to know them if you're working with such different players so frequently, and how different are they, do you find?
I think it's the difference, a little bit of a difference. I don't know if this is a good analogy, but like dating someone or marrying someone. You know what I mean? Like when you go just for a week with people that you haven't met before, it's all about just trying to make a connection and get to some place where you can have a great conversation and, you know, do something important. Because usually I meet the orchestra 2 days before the concert, and I have to establish some kind of rapport and get a motivation going and everybody on the same page. With an orchestra that you see regularly, that you're married to, you get to keep returning. So you can start to build the relationship out more. You know, it can be more dimensional, I think. And I think with the BSO, I can continue that. Even though I haven't been principal conductor for a few years, I can come back and still build on where we were. Yeah. Don't you think?
These like that presumably you've done a few times, a lot of times, and that is quite well known. How do you, when you're doing it again, how do you approach it in such a way as to sort of to be different, if that's what you want to do?
Well, you know, I don't try to approach a piece to try to make it different necessarily, but I try to go back to pieces and I like to reread sometimes the biographies, and I read a lot about the composers, and I like history as well, and the context of the piece itself. I'm studying Shostakovich 7 again at the same time, so I'm really thinking a lot about Shostakovich, and he lived in a time when artists were very repressed, and the government they censored everything people did, but it wasn't a predictable kind of censorship. Like if you rubbed somebody the wrong way or looked at them the wrong way, it's kind of that was it. And Shostakovich, he went from being at the pinnacle of celebrated composer and revered in the Soviet Union, and then they suddenly didn't like his music, and so then nobody could play his music. It was devastating for him. So I try to get into the mindset of this person who's obviously rightfully paranoid, wants to send a message to the people who are anti-establishment, anti-government, but needs to save somehow salvage himself in their eyes. So he's got a lot of things he's got to do through this piece, and how much of it is ironic and hidden and double entendre, that kind of thing really interests me. It starts with a big battle in the low strings. They're like this, and it goes from that to complete depression and apathy. And so there's a huge emotional range right away at the beginning of the piece. And then in the last moment, there's a big march that, the Soviets thought, oh, this is great, it's so patriotic, it just sounds like the music we've been dying to hear. But I don't think it's that kind of march at all. It's like a march in one of your nightmares, where you can't really quite move. It's trying to move ahead, but it can't. And so I think he achieved the unachievable, really, which is that he was thumbing his nose at them and sending a message to his people, but also they thought he was great again. So he achieved all that in this piece somehow.